Still, the envelope rested in my hand as my son stood by the Christmas tree and told me to find my own place. As I folded the paper once, slowly, I kept my face calm and my voice steady enough to say nothing at all. While the stiff paper pressed into my palm, the room felt colder, the silence louder than any argument. The same envelope weighed heavier as I realized everyone assumed I'd just lost my home. That's when it became clear. He never knew whose name was truly on the ground beneath us. Still, I held the envelope, deciding to walk away quietly because patience is the sharpest form of justice. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The house was suffused with the soft glow of Christmas lights, their multicolored shine reflecting off the delicate snow that clung to the windows. The tree stood in the corner, its ornaments glittering, but there was something wrong. The warmth of the season was absent, replaced by a coldness that wasn't from the outside air. The decorations were pristine, arranged with perfect symmetry, but they felt like props in a performance, one that no one had the energy to put on. Walter sat in his armchair by the fire, his old eyes scanning the room. He could feel the strain in the air, a tension beneath the surface of forced smiles and hollow greetings. The laughter was too loud, too quick. Daniel stood near the tree, shifting uneasily, his gaze darting to Walter and then away, as if searching for the right moment to say what he'd already decided. Then Daniel moved toward him, extending an envelope with a flourish. It was sealed, neat, formal. Not the kind of thing a father should be handed on Christmas morning. Not the kind of thing a son should give his father on Christmas morning. Walter took the envelope slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. He opened it, expecting the kind of sentiment he'd come to expect from his son. Maybe a card, some kind of acknowledgement of the holiday. The words were simple, cold, sharp. Find your own place. Walter didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the note for a moment longer than necessary, trying to make sense of it, then folded it back into its crisp envelope. Rachel was watching. She was always watching. Her eyes didn't meet his, but Walter could feel the calculation in the air, the way her silence hung over the room. She stood near the kitchen doorway, her arms folded, her face unreadable. She didn't say anything, but then again, she didn't need to. Everything was clear, wasn't it? Daniel stood there, holding his breath, waiting, maybe for Walter to react, maybe for him to speak. But Walt only glanced up from the envelope, his expression still as calm as it had been when he first sat down. His voice came out in a low, steady murmur. I see. No explanation, no questions, just acceptance. The silence that followed stretched out longer than anyone had expected. Daniel's eyes flickered nervously between Rachel and his father, his chest rising and falling slightly faster than usual. Walter rose from his chair without another word. The house, once warm with the illusion of holiday cheer, now felt smaller, emptier. He walked to the door, the heavy weight of the envelope still in his hand, as though it was the only thing anchoring him to this moment. As the door clicked shut behind him, Daniel's relief was palpable, but there was no victory in his expression, only uncertainty. Rachel stood still, her face unreadable. For the first time, Walter wondered if she was disappointed, or if this was exactly what she had been waiting for. And outside, the snow began to fall heavier, covering everything in a blanket of cold, relentless white. The moment Walter stepped out, the house fell into a strained silence. The air was thick, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, the envelope still in his hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around it. He expected something, some sort of reaction, but Walter's departure had left him with nothing. No outburst, no fight, just the heavy, uncomfortable quiet. Daniel cleared his throat, and the noise felt too loud. He wasn't used to this discomfort. He had always been in control. But today, control felt slippery, like something he was losing, or maybe something he'd already lost. "It's about boundaries," Daniel said, his voice steady, even a little rehearsed. He spoke with the detached calm of someone delivering a business proposal, not a son explaining something personal. The words fell from his mouth with the cold precision of a decision already made. He needs his own space, independence. He can't just keep living off us forever. It's time. Rachel stood silently nearby, her arms crossed. She didn't need to say anything. Her approval was implied in the way she nodded, the subtle curve of her lips. She had been part of this plan, even if it had never been discussed aloud. There was no room for sentimentality here, just practicality. She was calm, almost serene, watching this play out like it was long decided, like it was inevitable. No one else in the room spoke. The others, family, relatives, whoever they were, shifted uneasily in their seats. They were too afraid to challenge Daniel, too uncomfortable to side with Walter. They were watching, waiting, but no one stepped in. They all just sat there, as if time had stopped, the weight of their silence pressing down harder than anything they could say. Daniel didn't seem to notice their hesitance. He was focused on the task at hand. He had to make them understand. Walter had to leave. It was the only way. Daniel's voice stayed even, his words a mix of necessity and justification. "This isn't about punishment. It's about moving on. We can't keep pretending things are fine. We can't afford to carry him forever. He needs to figure things out for himself." Rachel's nod deepened. Her eyes locked on Daniel, her expression unreadable. She agreed with him, of course, but there was a tension in the way she held herself, something not quite aligned. Was she worried, or was it the weight of what they just set in motion? Either way, Daniel didn't notice. Walter hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't fought it, and somehow that made it worse. His silence was something Daniel didn't know how to handle. He had expected resistance, anger even. But Walter hadn't said a word, just listened, absorbed. The quiet dragged on longer than Daniel had anticipated. He could feel the words starting to sour in his mouth, a creeping discomfort he couldn't shake. But there was no turning back now. He had made the decision, and there was no coming back from it. "I hope you understand," Daniel finished, his voice faltering only slightly. But Walter didn't answer. The silence hung heavy in the air, suffocating, and for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure of what was coming next. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. The quiet stretched on, thick and suffocating. As Daniel's words settled in the air like dust, the room seemed to hold its breath. But then, without a word, Walter stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate, but there was no hesitation. He didn't look back at Daniel or Rachel. He simply excused himself, his voice as calm as it had been when he first entered the room. "I'll be going now." The words hung in the air, their weight shifting as he made his way toward the door. It wasn't the kind of departure that demanded a dramatic exit or any grand confrontation. Walter didn't need to make a scene. His silence said everything that needed to be said. The family watched, but no one moved, no one spoke. There was an unspoken understanding in the room that his leaving wasn't up for debate, wasn't something to be stopped. Walter walked past the Christmas tree, the gifts still neatly arranged beneath it, untouched and unappreciated. The thought crossed his mind briefly. How they would stay like that, like ghosts in the corner of a room no one would visit. He didn't bother to open them. They weren't meant for him. They never had been. The house, the holidays, the facade of togetherness. It was all an illusion, one that had cracked and crumbled with each passing year. And today it had finally fallen apart. He packed only what he needed, no more. A couple of shirts, a pair of shoes, his coat, no sentimental keepsakes, no old photographs or mementos of a life that had somehow slipped out of his hands. Nothing that tied him to this place anymore. The essentials, the practical things, nothing more. He moved with a quiet resolve, his actions deliberate but efficient. There was no drama, no anger in the way he packed. It was just the way things were now. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt hollow. The ticking of the clock in the corner was the loudest thing in the room. The gift-wrapped boxes seemed to mock him, their bright paper and ribbons nothing more than reminders of what he had been forced to walk away from. Yet there was no feeling of loss, no bitter sting, only a strange sense of clarity, a peace that had eluded him for so long. Walter left the house without another word. His footsteps were steady, the crunch of snow under his boots, the only sound as he made his way down the front steps. The cold air hit his face, sharp and biting, but it was refreshing, clean. He breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of the last few days, the last few years, begin to lift. It was done. Over. He had no need to fight anymore. Inside, Daniel watched from the window. He felt something stirring inside him, something that felt like victory, but was hollow. He had won, hadn't he? Walter was gone, just as he had planned. But instead of the satisfaction he thought he would feel, there was only a strange emptiness. He stood there, watching as his father disappeared into the distance, unsure of what he had actually gained. The victory was his, but the cost, that was still too unclear. Walter didn't look back as he walked away, and somehow that made it feel like he had never truly been there to begin with. Walter stood at the motel's counter, the bell above the door chiming softly as he signed in. The clerk barely acknowledged him, lost in a magazine. It didn't matter. Walter didn't need much. The small, dull room was exactly what he expected. Stale air, dim lights, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. He dropped his bag onto the mattress and sat down, staring at the peeling wallpaper, letting the quiet settle over him. In the stillness, memories began to flood in. He thought back to the early days, to the decisions he had made with confidence, with certainty. The house, the investments, the promises he had made to Daniel. He had been thorough, had insisted on safeguards, making sure everything was secure. He thought of the contracts, the clauses, the ways he'd protected his family's future, and how, over the years, those protections had been brushed aside. Daniel had always dismissed the fine print. He had always been too eager to move forward, too sure that everything would work out. "Don't worry about it, Dad," he would say. "We'll figure it out." The reassurance was always the same, but Walter had known. He had known that without the details, without the safeguards, things would go wrong. Daniel never saw the value in slowing down, in taking the time to understand the complexities of their finances. He only wanted results. Fast. Walter sighed, feeling the weight of it all. Over the years, assumptions had been made. Everyone assumed the house was Daniel's, that he was the one who controlled it all. But Walter never transferred full authority. He had kept a portion of the control for himself, quietly holding on to it in the background. He had always trusted that time, eventually, would show him the truth. And now it had. Daniel hadn't seen it coming. He thought he had won. But Walter had been waiting. Patience had been his secret weapon all along. Walter leaned back on the bed, the tension in his body easing. He closed his eyes and let the memories fade into the background. There was no anger, no regret, just a quiet understanding. Time had favored him, and as he drifted into sleep, there was peace in knowing that he had played the long game. Walter sat at the small desk in his motel room, the yellowed light from the lamp casting a faint glow over the cluttered papers in front of him. The weight of the evening was pressing down on him, but there was something else, too, something that nagged at him. The details, the fine print he had always taken such care with. He had walked away from the house without a fight, without even raising his voice. But something about Daniel's assumption, his certainty that the house was his, didn't sit right. He reached for the phone on the desk, dialing the bank's after-hours line. It was late, but Walter had waited long enough. He wasn't going to let this go. As the phone rang, the minutes ticking by, he felt a quiet determination settling in. He needed to know. He needed to understand just how far this had gone, how much Daniel had assumed without truly understanding. The voice on the other end was professional, detached. Walter explained his situation briefly, asking for confirmation on the details of the mortgage. He spoke slowly, deliberately, the words measured but sharp, as he requested the structure of the loan, step by step. The clerk on the other end was patient, answering each question with careful precision. "Just to confirm," Walter said, his voice steady. "Daniel Hargreave was not the primary borrower, correct?" There was a brief pause. The clerk responded, almost too quickly. "Correct. The primary borrower is listed as Walter Hargreave." Walter felt a small shift inside him, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. But he didn't say anything. He didn't react. He asked a few more questions, confirming the mortgage structure, the responsibilities, and the final authority. The answers came back exactly as he had suspected. Daniel had never truly held the keys to the house, the control, the ownership. It had always remained with Walter, tucked away in the clauses Daniel had ignored or misunderstood. Walter's mind raced as he processed the information. All this time, all the assumptions, the plans Daniel had made, had been based on a false premise. The house was never Daniel's to claim. It had always been Walter's. He thanked the clerk with quiet politeness, his tone calm, controlled. "Thank you for your help," he said, the words falling from his mouth with a practiced ease. The call ended, the line going dead. But Walter didn't move. He didn't need to. The knowledge was enough. He sat back in his chair, his fingers lingering on the desk. For the first time since he'd left the house, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It wasn't wide. It wasn't triumphant. It was something quieter, more satisfying. A simple acknowledgement that he had seen it all. He had known all along. But even as that small smile lingered, Walter felt the weight of the next step press down on him. He had the power. He had the truth. But what would he do with it? The house was quiet, save for the sound of Daniel's footsteps as he paced through the rooms, already envisioning the changes. He stood in the living room, eyes sweeping over the space, with unshakable confidence. The place was older, worn, but it had potential. It had always had potential. "We'll knock down that wall, put in a bigger kitchen here," Daniel said, gesturing with a wide sweep of his hand. "Open up the whole space. This place will be incredible." His voice was filled with optimism, the kind of certainty that had always gotten him what he wanted. The idea of transforming the house into something spectacular consumed him. He could already see it. The new cabinets, the fresh floors, the modern fixtures. It was the dream he'd been chasing for years. Rachel stood nearby, phone pressed to her ear, but her focus wasn't on the renovations. She was scrolling through emails, her fingers tapping lightly on the counter as she tried to reach contractors, confirm estimates, and schedule meetings. She was working, but the tension in her body was palpable. Something wasn't right. She glanced over at Daniel, still lost in his vision, his eyes alight with excitement. But there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach that refused to fade. The bank's responses had started to slow down. Calls went unanswered. Emails went without response. It wasn't like the bank to leave things hanging like this. And as much as Daniel brushed it off, Rachel couldn't ignore the creeping sense of unease that was building. Daniel, however, was undeterred. He moved to another room, still talking about the next steps, the possibilities, his voice filled with an unwavering optimism. "We've got this," he said, dismissing any concern with a casual wave of his hand. "It's just a matter of time before the bank comes through. We always get the funds, don't we?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She set her phone down, staring at the plans for the house. She wasn't sure if it was the slow bank response, the mounting pressure, or something else entirely. But she felt something shifting. Daniel didn't see it. He never did. Still, she kept quiet, masking her worry. He was so certain, so sure of himself. But deep down, Rachel knew the truth. The ground beneath them was starting to crack, and it wouldn't be long before it all came tumbling down. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows over the kitchen. As Daniel sat at the table, his mind lost in the details of renovation plans. Contractors, budgets, schedules. It was all there in front of him, a perfect blueprint for the future. He glanced at his phone, his finger scrolling through the usual notifications, when something stopped him cold. Payment failed. Daniel blinked, double-checking. That can't be right. His chest tightened as he opened the bank's app. The balance was fine. The account was healthy. There was no reason why the mortgage payment hadn't gone through. His thumb hovered over the screen, the weight of the moment sinking in. He tapped again, refreshing the page, hoping for something different. But the message remained the same. Payment failed. Frustration rose like a tide, but Daniel shook it off. It was probably just a glitch, right? He dialed customer service quickly, the urgency in his movements betraying his calm exterior. "Hello, how can I assist you today?" A polite voice greeted him. "I'm calling because my mortgage payment didn't process. Can you check on that for me?" His voice was even, but his mind was already running through explanations. The representative assured him it was probably a technical issue and asked for a few details. Daniel waited, tapping his fingers on the table, impatience building with every passing second. A few minutes later, the voice came back. "Mr. Hargreave, I'm transferring you to the next department for further investigation." Daniel groaned, but didn't say anything. After what felt like an eternity, he was on the phone with someone else, his irritation rising. But then something caught his attention, just faintly in the background. A name. Walter Hargreave. Yes, the primary borrower. Daniel's heart skipped. Walter Hargreave? His eyes went wide. "Wait, what about Walter Hargreave?" He cut in, his voice sharper now. There was a pause on the line, then a hesitant response. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll need to escalate this. It may take some time to resolve." Daniel froze. Walter's name? The primary borrower? That didn't make sense. Daniel was sure he was the one managing everything. But now, something was wrong. The call ended, and the unease settled into a cold, gnawing feeling. The confidence he'd had just moments before was slipping away. There was more to this than a missed payment. Something was shifting beneath him, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, tapping on his laptop, his focus flickering between contractor bids and the ever-growing list of renovation plans. The mortgage payment still hadn't gone through, and each call to the bank ended with the same vague response. But he wasn't going to let it distract him. He refused to let it ruin the momentum he had going. "It's fine, Rachel. It's just a technical delay," he said, eyes glued to the screen. "Holiday season, you know how it is. The bank is just backed up." Rachel stood across the table, her arms crossed, watching him. Her eyes were sharp, but her voice remained even. "That's what you've been saying for days, but nothing's getting done. The paperwork still stalled. We're not getting any answers." Daniel's gaze snapped up to hers, frustration flickering in his eyes. "I told you it's fine. Everything's under control. The bank's just a little behind. They'll get to us. Just give it time." She stepped closer, her voice quiet but pressing. "But we can't afford to wait much longer. You've been brushing it off like it's nothing. But it's not nothing. The payments are stalled. The calls aren't being returned. Something's wrong." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he slammed the laptop shut, the noise sharp in the stillness. "I don't need you to keep repeating this, Rachel. I've got it under control." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Rachel stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel it, the way he was clinging to this illusion, refusing to face what was unfolding. He wasn't convinced, not deep down, but he wouldn't admit it. He grabbed his phone and dialed the bank again, his fingers moving quickly, as though that simple action would fix everything. But when the call ended in more vague promises, Daniel's shoulders sagged just slightly, the confidence cracking. "See," he said, holding the phone out toward her, his voice defensive. "It's fine." But Rachel wasn't reassured. She knew the truth was slipping through their fingers, and Daniel wasn't ready to accept it yet. The air between them thickened, the silence louder than the words they hadn't spoken. Time kept moving, but nothing was getting fixed, and Rachel could feel the walls closing in around them. The dim light of the motel room cast long shadows across the small wooden table where Walter sat, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Maggie, sitting across from him, methodically reviewed the legal documents spread out in front of her. Her eyes scanned each clause carefully, her finger tracing the fine print, a practiced precision in her movements. Walter didn't rush her. He knew she'd been through these papers before, but today the stakes felt heavier. "Everything's in place?" Walter asked, his voice low but clear. Maggie glanced up from the papers, nodding once. "It's all here, Walter. Every clause you put in years ago. The protections are solid." She shifted the papers aside, folding her arms across her chest. "This will work." Walter didn't speak immediately. He absorbed the words, taking them in with the same calm that had defined him for decades. He knew Maggie was right. He had anticipated moments like these, years ahead, when the ground might shift beneath him. His decisions had been deliberate, each safeguard put in place carefully. He glanced at the clock on the wall, feeling the pull of time. "What's the deadline?" Maggie's eyes narrowed as she checked the dates. "The timeline is tight. You have a window, but it's closing fast. The legal clock is ticking." Walter nodded. He'd expected as much. Patience had always been his strategy, but even he couldn't deny the urgency now. There was no time to waste. The moment had arrived. Without hesitation, Walter stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He slipped his jacket on and reached for his phone. He dialed the bank directly, his voice steady when he asked for an in-person meeting. He knew it wasn't the usual way to handle things, but it was the quickest route to getting what he wanted. The call ended, and he tucked the phone back in his pocket. "We're going now," Walter said, his tone almost casual. He didn't need to negotiate. He didn't need to plead. The decision had already been made. At the bank, Walter didn't waste any time with small talk. He presented the documents, calmly rejected the restructuring options, and signed the single paper that would make everything official. It was done. As he walked out of the bank, a quiet sense of clarity washed over him. There was no victory to savor, no celebration. Only the steady weight of knowing the next step was already in motion, and all that was left now was to wait. The quiet of the house felt like a farce. Christmas decorations still clung to the windows, a reminder of a day that had already slipped away into the distance. The tree sat in the corner, its twinkling lights almost mocking the stillness of the air. The warmth inside was a forced comfort, but Daniel felt nothing but the cold weight pressing in on him. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes glued to her phone as she scrolled through emails, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. He had made his peace with the situation, convinced that all would be fine. The bank would come through. Everything would work out. He barely noticed the sound of the doorbell at first, but when the knock came again, it was louder, insistent. Daniel stood, walking to the door, irritation tightening his jaw. A delivery, probably some paperwork he hadn't yet reviewed, maybe a holiday card. When he opened the door, the postman stood with a thick envelope in hand. Certified mail. Daniel raised an eyebrow, wondering what could warrant something so official. He took the envelope without a word, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. The postman left without a glance, disappearing down the driveway. Daniel turned the envelope over, his thumb working the seal open, with a little more effort than usual. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible hesitation in his movements, but he shrugged it off as he unfolded the letter, scanning the page with an almost detached curiosity. He read it once, then again, his eyes narrowing as the words began to sink in. The language was formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Foreclosure. The word stood out starkly on the page, a sudden jolt that left Daniel rooted to the spot. His hands shook, but he didn't let himself show it. He reread the letter once more, trying to make sense of it. There was no mistake. The house wasn't his. It never had been. The authority he thought he held, the control he believed he had, it was gone. Rachel had watched him carefully from her seat at the table. When Daniel looked up, his face had drained of color. The arrogance he'd worn like a shield for weeks had disappeared, replaced by something unrecognizable. Panic. The thing he had ignored for so long had arrived. And with it, everything started to collapse. Rachel didn't speak at first. She simply stood, crossing the room slowly. Her fingers brushed against the letter as she read the dates, confirming what Daniel had already realized. Her face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, a hint of something darker, a recognition that they had been wrong, that their control had always been an illusion. Daniel dropped the letter on the table, his fingers lingering on the edge of it. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his voice small. Christmas, the lights, the house, everything that had felt secure. Everything that had promised a future suddenly seemed so far away. The weight of it all pressed in on him, and in the quiet of that moment, Daniel realized something he couldn't ignore. He was losing everything. And as the silence between them stretched, Rachel's gaze never left the letter. The future they had banked on slipping further out of reach. Daniel's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the persistent vibration like a quiet reminder of the sinking weight in his chest. The letter from the bank still lay on the table, its words imprinted on his mind. Foreclosure. It had been a blow, a gut punch. He had never imagined it would come to this. But there was no time to dwell on the shock. He needed answers. He needed to fix this. He reached for his phone, dialing Walter's number without a second thought. The ringing on the other end seemed to stretch into eternity, each second louder than the last. But the call went straight to voicemail. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment. Then he left the message, carefully controlled, every word measured. "Dad, it's Daniel. We need to talk. This isn't funny anymore. Call me back." His voice was tense, but still steady, a thin thread of control running through the words. As he ended the call, he stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if Walter would listen, if he would understand the gravity of the situation. Minutes passed, then hours, and no response came. Daniel's mind raced. He dialed again. This time the ringing seemed louder, more impatient, but still no answer. His finger pressed the screen harder, frustration building in his chest. Another voicemail. The message was different this time. "Dad, I'm not kidding around. You need to pick up the phone. I don't care what's going on, but you need to fix this." He ended the call with more force this time, his pulse quickening. He was angry, no longer willing to sugarcoat the situation. Walter had to know this was serious. He had to respond. But again, the silence stretched on. Daniel stared at the phone in his hand, feeling the cold weight of the silence settling deeper into his bones. Time was running out, and his grip on the situation was slipping. His next text was different. It was sharp, direct, defensive. "I don't know what your problem is, but you're about to lose everything. Pick up the damn phone." He hit send before he could second-guess it, his heart pounding in his chest. But the phone remained silent. No message back, no call, nothing. The words he had been holding inside, the anger, the frustration, all of it was bubbling to the surface now, out of control. He couldn't keep pretending this was just a miscommunication. Another call, another voicemail. He didn't even leave a message this time. His finger hovered over the screen as the ringing continued, his mind swimming with thoughts that only deepened the panic. His control was slipping. Each unanswered call, each empty second, made the walls feel closer. The house, the future, everything he had thought was his. It was all slipping away, faster than he could grab hold of it. And still, no response. The bank's lobby was colder than Daniel expected. The sterile, polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights above, casting an artificial glow that made everything feel distant, removed. He paced back and forth near the entrance, his palms clammy, his thoughts scattered. The weight of the foreclosure notice from days ago still pressed against his chest, but he wasn't ready to admit that reality yet. Not here. Not now. Rachel stood beside him, her face impassive, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had been quiet ever since the morning when Daniel first told her about the bank's refusal to cooperate. Now, as they waited for the meeting to begin, her silence was like a barrier, her calm demeanor the only thing holding him together. But Daniel could feel the tension beneath her composed exterior. The same unease he couldn't shake. She knew things were slipping away. But she said nothing. She didn't have to. A man in a suit approached them, offering a polite, almost rehearsed smile. "Mr. Hargreave, Ms. Hargreave, thank you for coming in. If you'll follow me, we can get started." Daniel straightened up, walking with a newfound determination. The time for games was over. As they entered the office, the banker gestured to the seats across from his desk. But Daniel didn't sit. He stood there, facing the man with a quiet intensity. The air in the room seemed to thicken as he began to speak. "This isn't just a financial matter. You don't understand. This is family." Daniel's voice was tight but firm. He looked the banker in the eye, his words carrying the weight of years. "My father built this house. This wasn't just a property. It's history. It's everything." The banker didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. His hands remained folded in front of him, the calm indifference in his eyes betraying no trace of sympathy. "Mr. Hargreave, I understand the sentiment, but contracts don't care about history. They're not designed to account for family. They're designed to be followed." Daniel's jaw tightened, the room suddenly feeling smaller. The words he had expected were finally here, but they didn't make them easier to hear. Family didn't matter. None of it mattered. The structure, the safeguards, the legacy, all of it was secondary to the paperwork in front of them. Rachel stayed quiet, her eyes flicking to Daniel but never leaving the banker's face. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd sat down, but the tension in her stillness was palpable. Daniel could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but there was nothing to say anymore. He was trapped. "Are there any options?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now, strained, a hint of desperation bleeding through the facade. The banker shook his head. "There's no restructuring, Mr. Hargreave. There's nothing to negotiate. The decision is final." Daniel's heart sank. All his plans, all the back and forth, the hope that the bank would find some way to help, it was gone. There were no more options, nothing to fight for. Reality hit him like a cold wave. The house wasn't his, not anymore, and nothing he could do or say would change that. The meeting ended in silence, the banker offering a polite handshake. But Daniel didn't take it. He turned toward the door, Rachel following behind. Neither of them spoke as they left the office, the finality of the moment settling between them. Outside, the cold air felt sharper, colder, like a fresh wound. The world hadn't changed, but everything had. And Daniel wasn't sure how to keep moving forward anymore. Daniel's car screeched to a halt in front of the dilapidated motel, the gravel lot crunching beneath the tires. He stepped out quickly, his mind racing. The letter from the bank, the unanswered calls. It all led him here. He couldn't believe it had come to this. But there was no turning back now. He needed to see his father. Walter's motel room was tucked behind a row of aging trees, isolated and quiet. Daniel knocked hard on the door, his impatience thick in the air. A few seconds later, it creaked open, revealing Walter. His face was neutral, almost unreadable, though the tiredness in his eyes was impossible to miss. "What's going on, Dad?" Daniel demanded, his voice tight. "I need your help. We need to fix this." Walter stepped back, opening the door wider, but said nothing. Daniel entered, his eyes scanning the small, unkempt room. The air smelled stale, but Walter didn't seem to notice. "I can't keep doing this, Dad. The bank's taken everything. It's all falling apart," Daniel said, his voice trembling. But he fought to keep it together. "I need you to help me. You're the only one who can fix this." Walter's gaze remained steady, his silence stretching between them. Daniel's chest tightened, the frustration building into something more urgent. He needed to break through, to make his father understand how bad it had gotten. "I'm asking for your help," Daniel continued, his voice softer now. "This house, it's everything. It's our future, my kids' future. You can't just walk away from this." Walter didn't move, didn't speak. His calmness made Daniel's anger flare. He stepped closer, desperation taking hold. "I don't know what you want from me. You can't just let this happen. I have grandchildren. I have a family to think about." Walter finally spoke, his voice even, measured. "Daniel, you've always had what you needed, but you never saw it." He didn't raise his voice, just delivered the words like facts, like truths he'd been waiting to say for years. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers Walter had pulled from his bag, silently handing them over. Walter stood, turning his back to Daniel. "It's your fight now." Daniel held the papers, his mind reeling. The silence was deafening, and in that moment he realized he had no more control. What would he do now? The courtroom was stark, too quiet, the air thick with the weight of what was unfolding. Daniel sat stiffly, his hands clenched on the table, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing in his ears. The judge flipped through the papers in front of him, each page adding to the suffocating silence. His eyes darted nervously from the judge to the bank's lawyer, who sat across the room, calm and unreadable. The judge cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "We'll proceed with the review of the documents. All parties have had sufficient time to prepare," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the lawyer slide a few papers forward. The documents that had led him here, the foreclosure notice, the terms, everything that had once seemed distant and theoretical, now laid bare in front of him. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages carefully. Daniel's palms began to sweat, his mind racing, but he kept his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't want to miss a single word, even as the reality of the situation started to hit harder than ever. "Mr. Hargreave," the judge said, turning to Walter, who sat across from Daniel with his usual calm, his hands folded in front of him. "Can you confirm the details of the mortgage as outlined here?" Walter's voice was even, devoid of emotion. "Yes, Your Honor. The terms are correct. The documents are as they should be." The certainty in Walter's voice only deepened Daniel's frustration. He couldn't sit still anymore. "This isn't right," Daniel blurted out, his voice breaking through the quiet of the room. "You can't just let this happen. This is my family's future, my children's future." His words spilled out faster than he could control them. The room went still, and Daniel's heart sank. He knew he'd crossed a line, but it didn't matter anymore. The judge's eyes remained fixed on the papers in front of him, his expression unchanged. "Mr. Hargreave," the judge said finally, his tone firm, "the details are clear. Judgment is issued." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Daniel sat frozen, the weight of the decision crashing over him. Walter stood slowly, collecting his papers, unaffected, and as the room emptied, Daniel was left in the quiet, the judgment final, the silence unbearable. The front door was locked, but the notice on it was impossible to ignore. A single sheet of paper, its edges curling slightly from the wind, was taped to the wood. The words "foreclosure notice" printed in bold black ink. Daniel stood on the front porch, staring at the notice, his breath catching in his throat. His mind swirled, the world around him quiet except for the rustling of the leaves in the yard, the far-off hum of traffic. The house, his house, was slipping away, piece by piece, with each passing moment. He reached for the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. Not yet. Rachel was already inside, packing up what little she could. She moved quickly, methodical, not even sparing a glance at the notice or at Daniel as she moved from room to room, gathering boxes. Her movements were quick, as though the faster she worked, the less she had to think about what was happening. She didn't speak, but Daniel could feel the distance between them growing. Her silence was louder than any words could be. Daniel stood frozen on the porch, staring at the moving truck that had just pulled up in front of the house. Neighbors stood across the street watching from behind their curtains, pretending not to watch, but still, they couldn't tear their eyes away. It was all too obvious now. The end was here. They weren't just losing the house, they were losing everything they had fought to keep. The truck's engine rumbled, and the crew began unloading boxes, hauling them into the house without a word. Daniel's chest tightened. He should have been the one to move the boxes. He should have been the one leading them out, taking the final steps with some dignity. But here he was, standing motionless, unable to even make eye contact with anyone. Rachel packed first. It wasn't because she had more to move. It was because she was ready to leave. She was already mentally gone, already somewhere else. She didn't look at Daniel as she carried the last of their belongings to the truck. The silence between them felt suffocating, an invisible wall building higher with each passing minute. He could hear the sounds of the truck being loaded, the clink of glassware being wrapped. But inside, everything was silent. She didn't need him. Finally, Daniel moved. Slowly, he walked to the kitchen, retrieved the keys from the counter, and turned toward the front door. His fingers trembled as he approached the moving crew, holding the keys out, not meeting anyone's eyes. He handed them over with a simple motion, as though he were handing over a piece of himself he no longer recognized. The keys were accepted without a word. And when Daniel stepped back, watching as the last of their belongings was loaded into the truck, it hit him. The house was no longer his. It wasn't his home anymore. The doors were closed, the windows dark, and the house stood empty, like a hollow shell of the place he had once called his own. He turned away, his footsteps heavy on the pavement, the sound of the truck starting up behind him, the finality of it all settling over him. And still, there was no resolution, only the echo of footsteps in an empty house and the crushing weight of what was lost. Walter moved slowly through the house, his footsteps muffled on the wooden floors that had once echoed with life. The air was still, heavy with the silence that had settled in since the last of the moving trucks left. The rooms, once filled with warmth and chaos, now felt like empty shells, hollow, devoid of the energy that had once filled every corner. His fingers brushed against the banister as he climbed the stairs, the polished wood smooth beneath his touch. He remembered the years he'd spent choosing the right one, the hours spent in stores, the discussions with contractors, the way the wood had gleamed in the light of that first afternoon after it was installed. It had been a simple thing, a part of the house that most wouldn't notice. But to him, it had meant something more. It was a symbol of everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for. Now it was just a piece of furniture in a house that was no longer his. The scent of pine lingered faintly in the air, a remnant of the Christmas tree that had stood in the living room, the one Daniel had insisted on cutting down every year. The smell was comforting, yet bitter now, like a memory that had started to fade. It wasn't the holiday cheer Walter had once associated with it. It was something different now, a reminder of what had been lost. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. There was no sense of victory in the silence that now filled the rooms, no sense of vindication. The decision had been made, but it hadn't been an easy one. Not for him, not for anyone. He hadn't been fighting for the house. He had been fighting for something else, something deeper, more personal. And now that it was over, all he felt was alignment, a quiet sense of knowing the pieces had finally fallen into place. Walter descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. He walked to the kitchen, to the counter where he'd always left the keys. He picked them up, his fingers cool against the metal. The weight of them was lighter now, no longer attached to the weight of ownership, but something more transient, something that was slipping away. The keys were placed gently in an envelope, sealed, and he picked it up with care. With a single breath, he walked out the door, past the house that had been his home for so many years. It didn't feel like the end of something. It simply felt like the next step. Walter handed the envelope to the bank's representative, his expression unreadable. No words were exchanged. No need for them. He turned, walked back down the path, and left the house behind him. And as he walked away, the house stood in silence. It was no longer his, but somehow he felt at peace. What would come next he wasn't sure, but for now the future was waiting, quietly, just beyond the horizon. Daniel stood in the narrow hallway of his new apartment, his breath shallow as he looked around at the cramped space. It was a far cry from the sprawling house he had once called home. The walls were plain, the furniture sparse, barely enough to make it feel like a living space. But it was all he could afford now. The house had been taken, and with it, everything he thought he had secured for the future. The life he'd spent years building had unraveled in a matter of months. He had sold off the majority of his assets, downsizing in a way that felt too final, too stark. There were no more comforts, no more luxuries, just the cold reality of starting over from scratch. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and the anxiety in his chest only seemed to grow with each passing day. His career, once thriving, now languished under the weight of stress. Clients were few, deals were slower to close, and his reputation had taken a hit. Every meeting felt like a struggle, every conversation filled with the sense that people were waiting for him to fail. Rachel, too, had changed. She moved through their new life with an almost robotic efficiency, her eyes never quite meeting his. They spoke less, the conversations always awkward, strained. The intimacy that had once defined their relationship had evaporated, replaced by a cold distance. The blame hung between them like an unspoken accusation. She had her own frustrations, her own struggles with what they had lost. But there was no space to talk about it, no room to breathe. They had tried, briefly, to repair the cracks, but it was clear the damage had been done. Their marriage, like everything else, was fraying at the edges, slowly falling apart under the weight of their shared failures. Meanwhile, Walter had moved on. It was a quiet shift, but it was there, unmistakable. He had restructured his assets, eliminating the dependencies that had once tied him to the past, the house, the ties to his children, to the life he had built for them. It was all part of a past he had quietly distanced himself from. His finances were solid, his future secure. There was no longer any need to worry about survival. Where Daniel felt the tightening grip of uncertainty, Walter felt the slow expansion of peace. He moved through his days with a clarity that had eluded him for so long. There was no bitterness, no regret, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had taken control, of knowing his future was no longer defined by others. But as Daniel looked out the window of his new apartment, the weight of his choices still hung over him. The future stretched out before him, uncertain, and though he had the will to push forward, the question remained: could he rebuild what he had lost, or had the foundation already been irreparably cracked? The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, plain and unremarkable against the sea of bills and flyers that cluttered the kitchen counter. Walter didn't recognize the handwriting, but the moment he picked it up, he knew what it was. The weight of it settled in his chest, the way it had before, the familiar tug of something unresolved, something he had been waiting for but never expected. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge, the same hand that had once written checks for things that no longer mattered, the same hand that had signed papers he never thought he'd need to read again. He could already hear Daniel's voice, the anger, the desperation. Find your own place. The words from that morning still echoed in his mind, but they had become background noise now. Walter slowly opened the envelope, the paper inside heavy and thick, as if every word had been carefully considered. It was a long letter, more than a page, the ink smudging slightly where the words had been written in haste. The tone was emotional, defensive, as if Daniel had poured every ounce of his guilt and frustration into it. The letter spoke of regret, of misunderstandings, and of the burden of the past. He wrote about how difficult things had been, how he felt betrayed by Walter's absence, how he had tried to carry everything on his own. But underneath it all, Walter could feel the blame, the thinly veiled accusations that hung between the lines. Daniel was apologizing, yes, but it was the kind of apology that still needed to be right, still needed to shift some of the weight back onto Walter's shoulders. Walter read it once, his eyes skimming over the words that didn't seem to change anything. He felt a strange sense of detachment, a quiet realization that no matter what was written on the page, it didn't undo anything. The house was gone. The family was fractured. There was no simple fix. He folded the letter carefully, not out of respect, but because it felt like the right thing to do. The pages, heavy with words and unspoken truths, were tucked away in the drawer of the kitchen table, the same place where he had kept all the important things, his keys, his documents, things that no longer had meaning but were somehow impossible to throw away. No reply, no explanation. Walter sat back, the silence in the room louder now. A strange peace began to settle in, deeper than anything he had expected. He was no longer angry, no longer searching for answers. It was over. And yet, as the calm washed over him, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left unsaid, something that he hadn't quite closed the door on. The first snow of the season fell lightly against the windows, dusting the world outside in white, softening the harsh edges of the world. It was Christmas Eve, and Walter stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The house was small now, quieter than the one they had once filled with laughter, arguments, and expectation. But it was enough. It was his. This year, things were different. There were no grand decorations, no massive family gatherings. He had invited only a few people, friends he had kept over the years, those who had never asked for anything from him, those who still respected him without an agenda. The house, smaller and simpler, felt warmer than it had in years. The weight of obligation had lifted. He set the table carefully, each plate in the right spot, the silverware polished but unpretentious. There were no extravagant centerpieces, no over-the-top displays, just a simple dinner, A quiet evening. When the doorbell rang, Walter didn't hesitate. He opened it to find Maggie standing on the other side, her smile warm and genuine. Behind her was Tom, a friend from work, and Rachel's aunt, who had flown in from out of town. None of them expected anything. There were no power plays, no false smiles. They were here for the evening, for the company, and maybe just for the peace. They sat at the table, the room filled with the soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of voices. Laughter bubbled up, real and relaxed, without any forced effort. It felt natural, the way it had when Walter was younger, before things got so complicated, before the games had started. There was no need for anyone to prove anything. The conversations were easy, familiar, and warm, like the soup simmering on the stove. Daniel wasn't there. Neither was Rachel. But there was no bitterness in Walter's chest anymore. No longing for the past. He had made his peace, one that came not from forgiveness, but from acceptance. The house they had fought for, the legacy they had believed in, it was gone. But Walter had found something else. He had found a quiet contentment in letting go, in knowing that there was life beyond the battles. As the evening wore on, Walter felt something shift inside him. The warmth of the people around him, the genuine laughter, the absence of pressure. It was everything he hadn't known he needed. This was what he had been waiting for. Not the apologies or the fights, just the peace of a new beginning. And as they finished the meal, no one made any promises. No one expected anything to change. But as the snow continued to fall outside, Walter knew this was the start of something new. And though it wasn't perfect, it was enough. The doorbell rang again, but Walter didn't move to answer it. He was content for the first time in a long while to just be. Walter sat in the dim light of his living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The house was quiet now, the bustle of the holiday season having faded into the stillness of late winter. It had been months since everything had unraveled. The house, the family, the life he had spent years building. But tonight, as he looked out the window at the snow gently falling outside, he found himself thinking back to a single moment, one that had changed everything. He could still picture the envelope, its crisp edges as it slid across the table, Daniel's eyes never meeting his as he handed it over. The note inside had been simple, but the weight of it had been suffocating. Find your own place. It had been more than just words. It had been a final declaration, a decision made without hesitation, an assumption that he would fold, that he would argue, that he would fight to stay. But Walter hadn't done any of those things. He hadn't begged. He hadn't shouted. He had simply folded the paper, stood up, and walked out. It wasn't a defeat. It wasn't even resignation. It was just the absence of any more words to say. There had been no grand confrontation, no emotional outbursts. When the moment arrived, Walter had simply accepted it, the way you accept a gust of wind that knocks you off balance. The house, the family, the years of hard work, they weren't his to keep anymore. And there was no need to explain it, no need to try to make them understand. He had done everything he could. Walter leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together in his lap, eyes closed as the memory played over him once again. He could still hear Daniel's voice, the desperation behind it, the anger. But even then, in the thick of it, Walter knew the truth. Daniel had assumed control, assumed the power was his. But he hadn't understood the ground beneath his feet. The ground had always belonged to Walter. He had never fought for it. He had never needed to shout or plead. He had simply reminded them of that one undeniable truth, the one that had been there all along, silent and unspoken, the one that time had proven true, again and again. And now, as he sat in the quiet of his new life, Walter felt something shift inside him. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't bitterness. It was something deeper, something that came from knowing he had stood, even when they tried to move him. They had tried to take everything, but in the end, Walter had held on to the one thing that truly mattered, his peace. But the silence still echoed with a question he couldn't answer. Had it been enough? Had the ground beneath his feet really been enough to carry him through this storm?